Thank you very much, Minister, Chair. DNV GL Group is very proud to be invited by President Grimson and Premier Kielsen to this event, and I must congratulate you also with putting together an extremely interesting, inspiring group of speakers. I hope not to let you down too far. I have been inspired by what I've heard thus far, and I will just follow up on what Gudjonsen mentioned, that if we are going further into the Arctic, let's do it in a stepwise approach, and we can learn from what we have done in the past. I would like to share some ideas about what our company, the DNV GL Group, established in 1864. What we think about are some of the technology challenges and some of the risks around hydrocarbon production and transportation in the Arctic. And I don't think we have to spend a lot of time to remind each other that the Arctic is creating a lot of interest for the fisheries, for the maritime new transportation routes, for the tourism. But there are also significant resources of hydrocarbons. So the hydrocarbons is attracting interest. And even though there could be some individual setbacks in some individual parts of the Arctic, that does not mean that the Arctic is not still a hydrocarbon-rich region. Okay. There are issues around any industrial activity in the Arctic as it is with the hydrocarbon activities. And one is regarding the impact. To what extent can we do it without creating too much or unacceptable negative impact on the people and on the nature where operations are going to take place. But I think we have also heard today that employment, economic growth, is also a tremendous value that we have to take into consideration. So industrial activities create values as well, and let's see how we can harvest that in a good way. Secondly, we also have a data challenge, a knowledge challenge in the Arctic. We do have a lot of knowledge, we do have a lot of data, but we don't have enough. So that's why the stepwise approach has to be taken so that we can gather and accumulate data and experience as we move forward. For those of you who are interested in the oil price, you might have noticed that the interest of the Arctic in the oil and gas area has lost a little bit of interest lately, primarily because of the lifting cost you have in the Arctic. So when you have a $40 price environment, the Arctic might look less competitive. However, with the oil price now moving up to 50, we also have to remember that the Arctic hydrocarbons does not come to market with some kind of premium certificate that this is Arctic oil. Because of that reason, it should fetch a premium. It will have to compete. It will have to compete with any oil from everywhere. But that's also the beauty of it, because you could easily see that there are hydrocarbons in the Arctic that can compete in the current price environment. Onshore fields can be relatively safely produced with existing technologies, existing standards. That's why they are relatively cheap to produce. Offshore fields need technology qualification and risk assessment to a much larger degree in order to be acceptable. And we see that some of the Arctic fields, most of them will need the same risk assessment technology qualification approaches to come forward. But we also see that in the Arctic there will be some fields that are not yet economically feasible or technologically accessible. The onshore fields today are pretty much in the remit, under the control of national oil companies, and they're not quickly giving that right away, which means that for those countries where you have difficult offshore fields or difficult to access Arctic fields, you have something to offer international oil companies, because international oil companies now don't have easy access to the onshore fields. International oil companies have the technology, and they have the finances, and they have the experience to handle difficult projects. Okay, we also don't have to remind each other that Arctic is not one place with one similar operational environment. And even two places with an equal distance to the North Pole would have vastly different operational challenges in terms of temperature, in terms of precipitation, in terms of ice conditions, which is why we always recommend, before you broadly write off the Arctic or before you broadly open up the Arctic, look into the individual challenges, the individual issues that you have on your field, and then decide whether this is a field where you can go forward. And the Arctic nations, they have their parliaments, they have their governments, they have their electorate, which ultimately establishes the risk acceptance level. What is the tolerable risk for operating in our waters? What do we think is okay to do in our national waters? And if you think that the risk should be zero, none of you would be here today, because when you took a taxi, when you took the plane, when you walked the street, you took a calculated risk to move with the fear of accident in traffic, fear of accident in air, because you think that risk is acceptable. So society also makes decisions about what we think is acceptable around oil and gas operations. And when we see the Arctic, we don't think in our company that the likelihood of problems in the Arctic are higher, but we think that the consequence will be more dire. We think the consequences will be more difficult. So if we make this in a simpler matrix, if we say that current oil and gas activities are acceptable in the traditional balloon here, you have a frequency picture and you have a consequence picture. If you move the operation into Arctic area, we don't think that the likelihood of the frequency of that accident will go up, but we think that the consequence will be more difficult. Search and rescue is a completely different issue when it's pitch dark and when the temperature is low than when you have a warmer temperature and when you have light. Search and rescue is much easier if you are close to infrastructure than if you are far from the infrastructure. So in other words, the risk picture in the Arctic changes because the consequence side of your operation is affected. So to bring Arctic operations down to a risk level that is still acceptable, we need to look at the standards and the technologies so that we bring the likelihood of accidents, the frequency of incidents, down to a level that is so low that we can agree that this is something that is an acceptable operation. There are two ways for governments to go about this issue, how to regulate how companies bring the safety back to an acceptable level. And we call those two typical approaches for the prescriptive safety approach or the performance-based safety approach. So my comments now will be on the offshore oil and gas safety regulatory side. I don't comment on the mining industry or the fishery industry. I'm just commenting on the oil and gas industry. So a prescriptive approach gives the detailed instruction how to do it, while a performance-based approach basically gives the companies freedom to handle it the way you need. If we rank this today, we consider the Russian and the American system going in the prescriptive direction, and we view Greenland, Norway, and Canada as the performance-based approaches. And since the Arctic will have new challenges, we strongly recommend that the performance-based approach is used to allow the use of new technologies and new standards. I heard the first bell, so let me quickly then wind up. Gas flaring is a waste of resources, and when we go into the Arctic, we should not repeat the heavy gas flaring that takes place other places in the world. There are methods to use the gas close to the source or to export it so that we don't have the black soot problems on the ice from the flaring. In the Barents Sea, on the northern sector of the Barents Sea, Norwegian sector, we have not yet seen negative impact on the sea. We see low probability of accidents, but we see further need for investments in oil spill contingency plans. This is my last slide. In our company, we also studied on behalf of the OG21, which 11 new technology areas we recommend to move the oil and gas operations forward. And these are available in the report that you can access with the address that is up there, and which I hope the organizer will make publicly available after this conference. Thank you very much.